The evening air inside the house was heavy, almost suffocating. I sat on the living room couch, staring at the muted television as the clock ticked closer to midnight. The blue glow of the screen flickered across the walls, but I wasn't watching. My mind was elsewhere. My wife had texted hours ago that she would be working late, again. At first, I wanted to believe her. She had always been ambitious, always the one who stayed after hours to get projects finished. But lately, something in her tone, in the way she said, "Don't wait up," had shifted. The warmth was gone. Her words had become mechanical. And tonight, as I sat in the quiet, the doubt that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally broke through. Her purse was sitting in the hallway, thrown carelessly over the chair. She must have forgotten it in her rush this morning. Normally, I respected her privacy. I never looked. But something inside me whispered that answers were waiting there. My hand shook as I stood, every step toward that purse feeling like a betrayal of my own. I hesitated, then reached inside. Lipstick, keys, wallet, a folded receipt crumpled in the side pocket. I unfolded it slowly. My heart stopped. It wasn't from a grocery store. It wasn't from a coffee shop near her office. It was from a downtown restaurant, a place we had never gone together, a place known for dim lighting, expensive cocktails, and intimacy. The receipt was dated last Friday, at 10:43 p.m. 2 entrees. 2 glasses of wine. Not the kind of dinner one had alone after a long day at work. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at that small slip of paper as if it were a bomb ready to explode. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. Was this real? Was this what I thought it was? The TV droned on in the background, a laugh track echoing through the room. It sounded cruel, mocking. I balled the receipt in my fist and shoved it into my pocket. Later that night, I heard her keys at the door. I quickly sat back down, pretending to flip through channels as if I hadn't just uncovered a piece of her betrayal. "Hey," she said, her voice light but tired. She set down her bag, hung up her coat, and walked into the room. Her hair was slightly tousled, makeup smudged in a way that suggested more than just long hours at work. "You're still up?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Couldn't sleep." She leaned down, kissed me on the cheek, and disappeared into the bedroom. I stared after her, bile rising in my throat. The following evenings were no different. More late nights. More excuses. I became hyper-aware of her patterns. The way she always checked her phone twice before leaving, the quick smile she forced when I asked about her day, the way she avoided eye contact just a little too long when answering simple questions. On Wednesday, she claimed she had a team dinner. I watched from the window as she walked out, her heels clicking on the pavement. But instead of the gray slacks she usually wore to the office, she was in a tight black dress I hadn't seen in years. My pulse spiked. That wasn't work attire. That was something else entirely. When she was gone, I sat at the dining table, hands gripping the wood until my knuckles turned white. The silence of the house mocked me. It was as if the walls themselves knew and were waiting for me to admit the truth. By the third week, my suspicion had hardened into conviction. I started noticing the faint perfume that wasn't hers lingering on her clothes. The way she showered immediately upon returning home. The sudden change in her playlists, soft, romantic songs she hadn't touched since college. I dug deeper. One evening, when she was in the shower, I checked her phone. She had grown careless. Or maybe too confident. Messages. Short. Discreet. "Same time? Can't wait." A smiley face. No name saved, just numbers. But the familiarity in those words was undeniable. One message, sent just hours earlier, froze my blood. "Friday. Hotel. Us." I dropped the phone back onto the counter as if it had burned me. I stared at myself in the kitchen window, my reflection pale and hollow. This was no longer suspicion. This was betrayal carved into pixels on a screen. I didn't confront her that night. Or the next. Instead, I lay beside her in bed, listening to her soft breathing, wondering how many of her sighs had belonged to someone else. I knew then that I couldn't act out of blind anger. If I confronted her without proof, she'd twist it, lie, make me the paranoid husband. No. I needed evidence so clear, so undeniable, that even she wouldn't be able to wriggle free. And so, in the quiet of my own home, I began planning her downfall. There's a peculiar silence that takes over a city at night, not empty, exactly, but patient. It waits around traffic lights and beneath closed shop awnings, and it makes sounds you don't hear during the day, the soft slap of tires on wet asphalt, the thin wind through a row of plane trees, the distant mechanical whisper of a bus cooling down. I learned to love that silence. I learned to live inside it. After the receipt and the messages and the small, unmistakable signs that had wrapped themselves around my life like a vine, my world shrank to a few coordinates: her car's license plate, the hotel's facade, and the glowing dot on the GPS app one had clumsily installed under her seat. The car became my compass. On the dash of my own, the little red pin pulsed like a heartbeat, and I tuned my life to its rhythm. The first few nights were clumsy. I'd tail her, then get nervous and fall back into my apartment itsy-bitsy safety. I'd park 2 blocks away with the engine ticking, and tell myself I would only watch. Only watch. But watching is an addiction. Proof is a kind of drug, and once you taste it, you'll plan your day around the next fix. On that first real night, the streets glittered with rain. Mist made the yellow lamps look soft, like someone had gone around blotting the city with a brush. Her dot moved, obedient and small. I followed. She turned left where she usually turned right. The dot slowed in the app as if hesitating, then stopped outside a building that was not the Pilates studio she claimed. The name on the awning blinked in neon: The Lark. A hotel bar that smelled of scotch and low light. I pulled into the lot, engine off, and sat. The breathing from the vent sounded loud in that small, metal room. I smoked 2 cigarettes even though I quit years ago. Bad habits return when the world gets messy. You find yourself reaching like an animal for familiar things. She stepped out of the car a few minutes later, dressed darker than the night, high heels that clicked like a language on the pavement. She walked with a confidence I hadn't seen in months, the way a woman moves when she's been complimented and believed, not when she's trying to convince a husband. A man with a navy blazer wrapped an arm around her shoulders and led her inside, like this was already a private joke between them. I wanted to follow right after them, to walk into glass and candles and laugh and tear it apart. But I didn't. I sat and waited until their dot moved again, long enough to be sure they were inside, long enough that discretion had a chance to be called patience rather than cowardice. The GPS blinked, then the 2 dots, hers and his, held steady. I texted my sister from the car window. "I'm here. Not sure what to do." Her reply was instant. Record. "Don't go insane. Be safe." So I recorded. Not with a camera at first. Stealth felt like a violation that I wanted to own carefully. I started with sound. I left the recorder in a small corner of the bar's open terrace when they went in, hidden under a napkin, the red light of consent glinting like a tiny eye. It's funny how your moral calculus shifts. I told myself I was conducting an experiment for the truth. Most people tell themselves better stories when they are doing the wrong things. The night hummed along, filled with a low murmur of other lives. He laughed. She answered in a way that made the sound melt. At one point the man leaned in, and their heads touched, a small private arrangement. I watched them through the glass, my reflection layered over theirs, like some terrible ghost. I felt both invisible and exposed, a spectator who had paid for a ticket he didn't want to admit buying. When they finally left, they did it like a practice couple, slipping to the elevator and vanishing up the glossy vestibule. I kept my distance. I drove by the hotel at a reasonable pace, pretending to be a man who had a map and a late appointment, and then I found the stairwell. Stairwells in hotels are transitional places. The air smells of detergent and of faint human fatigue. My footfalls were loud in that narrow space. At the third floor, I paused and listened. Laughter, the small, private kind that belongs to conspirators. I didn't knock. I placed the camera just below the door frame and felt like a child playing spy. What I saw through a tiny gap was a scene I had been waiting for and never wanted to see. Clothes draped like discarded flags. 2 glasses on the table with rings of condensation. Her hair undone. Their bodies closed the way bodies become close when they are borrowing tenderness. The camera captured them moving in close, and finally folding into a kiss that took what it wanted without consideration. The rawness of it made my chest hurt in an unrecognizable way. I could have stormed in. I could have smashed the door open and screamed and made the world messy and real invisible. The man would have probably become a blur of embarrassment and guilt, and my wife might have cried and begged, and there would be drama and a police report, and everyone would feel something loud and immediate. But I wanted more. I wanted a ledger, not the soundtrack of a meltdown. I wanted her story to be a line item she couldn't sweep up with a napkin. So I held the camera's feed like a secret and left. I walked down the stairwell like a man who has just walked through glass and found his hands still whole. The night swallowed the sound of my breath. There were nights after that I drove and didn't stop. When the app showed the dot inching into the city, I'd follow to the edges of clubs, through parking garages that smelled of oil and old coffee, past late-night diners, where the neon made everyone look like an actor. I learned the rhythms of their togetherness, how they came and went, where they parked, how long was too long before panic became practical action. Once, they took a taxi instead of her car. The app would show nothing and my chest would rise with phantom signals. I trailed the cab like a shadow, never getting too close. The taxi stopped outside an apartment building with potted plants on the steps and a doormat that pretended to be cheerful. I parked across the street and watched the windows light up like a slowly igniting script. The man helped her up the stairs and then, unfathomably, left. She went in alone. The GPS would later show the dot vanish and reappear hours later. A simple game of hide and seek. Each disappearance felt like another loss. I learned my own city by following her. I saw neighborhoods I hadn't noticed. I drank coffee from places I'd only ever walked past, the bitter liquid a kind of companionship during my vigils. I took pictures of license plates and wrote down times and dates in a spiral notebook until the lines blurred and the ink smeared. There's a strange intimacy to cataloging someone's life like this. You begin to feel like an archivist of another person's betrayal. Doubt visited at odd hours. I'd find myself thinking about the moments she had been generous. Late dinners cooked for me, messages left on my phone when I was away, the morning she had held my hand when my father called sick. Those memories came forward as if to intervene, to plead a case on her behalf. Maybe, I thought dizzily, there was some explanation. Maybe it wasn't what I feared. But then the app would chime and the recorders would capture a laugh, and the shadowed image of them together would answer the doubt with a kind of brutal simplicity. There were practical problems to manage. Tail someone through a city, and you are suddenly very aware of headlights, of patrol cars, of the way your own car looks parked for a long time outside a hotel. You develop strategies. Move every 10 minutes. Buy change of clothes to get out of a car and appear as a passerby. Sit in the back of a restaurant and pretend to be reading a book. I learned to walk the line between not being seen and being there, like a ghost who keeps private hours. Finding evidence wasn't just about satisfying a fury, it was a kind of insurance. In the thin light of my car's interior, I considered what would happen if I simply exposed her then and there. The man would leave embarrassed, she would apologize, we would go to therapy and the cameras would document the apologies, and the social media would quiet down. But that was the problem. Apologies can be made, apologies patched like temporary stitches. I wanted something that could not be easily repaired. A record, a file, a truth that would stick to her story like glue. So I refined my methods. I upgraded cameras, smuggled a small mic into the bar's flowerpot one night, learned how to angle a lens without getting caught, how to make sound clear even when being muffled by music. The work was clinical, surgical. The more I prepared, the less my actions felt like the response of a wounded animal, and the more they felt like the work of someone who had decided on the shape of his own life. Between the nights I was on the road, I slept badly. When I did sleep, it was a paranoid, watchful thing. Every siren made me bolt upright. Every unexpected knock sent me to the window. It was exhausting. My friends noticed. My boss noticed. They asked if I was okay. My answers were thin and practiced. "Stress at work," I said. "Too much to handle." It's easier to be believed when your hands are steady over a keyboard and you talk about metrics. There were moments of near catastrophe. Once the man, the one she was with, almost noticed me. I had been parked in a narrow side lane behind an anonymous delivery van, the van's owner mercifully gone. He passed by briskly, then turned, then his face softened like a sun coming out. For a second I thought he recognized the car, then he moved on. I felt my knees quake later in the driver's seat, relieved and ashamed of being spared. On a rain-slick Thursday, the city felt like a watercolor. He came out of a building alone, checked his phone, and glanced toward the street at the place where I was, only I wasn't there. I had pulled back, out of instinct. He laughed at something on his screen and walked off. My jealousy was a physical ache, a hunger that wouldn't be sated by just knowing. I wanted the satisfaction of a public truth. But I also wanted something measured. Even now, there are things I regret. The way I hid under a streetlight and watched him cross into a flower shop to buy a small bouquet, white daisies, the sort of thing that says apology without speaking. Did he think of me at that moment? Did he hear some small twinge, do a version of what I had to do later? I am not the type of man who looks for poetic justice in a florist's door. But our lives are a collage of tiny ignitions like that one, and they gather into a flame. One night, the app blinked and then froze. The dot had been moving, and then it stopped entirely. Panic does unkind things to you. I waited 15 minutes, then called the number I tracked. It went straight to voicemail. I sat in my parked car and tried to imagine the worst. Had something happened? Had he taken her somewhere and refused to leave? Had the man decided to make things irreversible? My head filled with scenes, some of them dull, some unforgivably cinematic. Then the dot reappeared, slow as if waking. Relief swept through me like nausea. Later, I learned he'd taken her to a friend's off-site meeting room, an empty corporate space where the lights were too bright and the furniture was designed to be neutral. They had coffee and pretended the world outside wasn't theirs. The recorder I had tucked into a potted plant captured them talking in tones that were at once mundane and loaded. "Next week, same place? If work covers it, say you had to go." I listened to the recording once, twice, and then I deleted it from the queue. Not because I had mercy, but because I wanted to control the narrative, not have it spill out to any ears. I began drafting the endgame on napkins and on the margins of documents at work. It was a plan that tried to be surgical and fair. No humiliation for the sake of spectacle. No petty public shaming that would make me into something else. The goal was to take what she had hidden and make sure it could not be hidden again. I wanted the truth to land where it had weight, in front of people who mattered to both of us. The ledger had to be composed with care. And so I kept following. Night after night, I learned that a man can live a double life for a while, but eventually, routine demands a rhythm, and rhythms create patterns that can be read. She preferred a Wednesday. He liked a dim bar. They both liked the Lark's third-floor suite because it had a balcony where cigarette smoke could be shared with a skyline. These were not things I wanted to admit loving in my newfound expertise, but they were fact. One particular night stands with me like a photo I keep in the wallet of memory. It was almost spring. The air had a bite to it that promised thaw. Their dot stopped outside a low building and then split into two. I parked under the shadow of a sycamore, the sidewalk slick with melting rain. My breath formed little ghosts in front of me, as if I was exhaling the past. I sat and waited. He appeared first, lighter than a man who knew his life could change at a glance. He looked confident. He looked foolishly natural. She followed, eyes bright and searching the way someone scans a room when she's alive in a way marriage had forgotten to allow. They met, and in that meeting I felt more than simple betrayal. I felt time shift. The years of routine, of comfort, of assumptions, slid into a different alignment. The world would not be the same. This time, I didn't run the camera immediately. I stayed in the car and watched as they crossed the boulevard and disappeared into a building that housed small event rooms and corporate retreats. I drove around the block twice, geeking out with the GPS, watching their dots move together. I felt less like a man and more like a cartographer, mapping the topography of another person's treason. Sometimes, in the quiet between tales, I thought about consequences. What would come after the evidence? How would I survive the cascade of questions, of pity, of the slow, invasive curiosity of people who cared enough to sit in judgment? I feared turning into someone who took pleasure in the spectacle. I feared that my revenge might look cruel rather than corrective. Those were the nights I leaned on my sister's texts and the voice of a friend I hadn't told everything to. Be smart. Be better than it. Their voices kept me human. The following Wednesday, the GPS dot led me back to a small hotel on a lane that felt like a street designed with facades, artful, just shallow enough to be charming. I parked 2 blocks away and observed. She arrived, he arrived, and again they slipped into a room with the practiced secrecy of people who had rehearsed their departure. I kept my distance, but I kept my notes, my recordings, my little archive of proof. There were moments where the moral temperature in me rose, and I almost lost the plot. I almost left angry voicemails. I almost sent anonymous texts. But I didn't. The man could have been someone I once called friend. The woman was someone I once trusted with my mornings. This wasn't theater for an audience. It was a life I had to decide what to do with. So I waited. Night after night, street after street, I followed a truth unspooling until it was taut. The city that had always been a backdrop to my life, where I bought bread, met friends, walked dogs, became a stage for a private tragedy. I learned to recognize the way someone tucks an intimacy into the creases of a city. I learned to follow without colliding into pity I might later regret. I learned, dangerously, that surveillance feeds a peculiar hunger that only some forms of closure can satisfy. And in the car, wrapped in a darkness that felt both protective and suffocating, I made a decision. When the time came, I would not scream. I would not make a scene for its own sake. I would gather the facts like coins and lay them out on a table with careful hands. I would let truth be a witness, not a spectacle. The streets would keep their silence. The city would keep its rhythm. And when the moment I had been orbiting finally arrived, I would be ready to end the story on my own terms. Until then, I continued to map her life with the patience of a man who believed that, in the end, clarity was a form of mercy, For myself, if for no one else. The hotel smelled like other people's good decisions. Faint perfume, overbrewed coffee left in a carafe, and a sanitizing scent that pretended cleanliness could erase choices. I had been in that lobby so many times before. Conference breakfasts, an anniversary we pretended was spontaneous. But tonight the place felt like a stage dressed for a play I hadn't auditioned for. I sat at a corner table with my coffee gone cold and a notebook open, though I mostly watched. The GPS dot was steady, a small red truth on my phone's screen. Her car had been there for 15 minutes. The man's dot pulsed next to hers like a slow heartbeat. People moved in the lobby. Travelers with maps, couples with suitcases, a concierge who smiled like he sold time by the hour. No one looked at me twice. That was the blessing and the curse of being a ghost in public. No one notices ghosts until they make noise. When she walked in, the world rearranged itself. It's hard to explain how a person can both be the same woman you have loved for years and feel suddenly foreign. Her hair was down, the way she let it fall when she wanted to feel seen. She smiled at the receptionist like she was casting a currency of charm. The man behind her, taller than me, jacket thrown back with careless confidence, slid his hand into the small of her back in a move that used to belong to me. The sight did something to my chest that was neither pain nor anger. It was a precise erosion. They sat at the far end of the bar, in a shadow that the pendant lamps couldn't quite reach. I pretended to read, which is to say I moved my eyes over words, like I was reading, while my brain rewound the last months in high fidelity. They ordered, they laughed in ways that matched, they traded small touches that said more than words. I recorded nothing on purpose at first. Watching is different from collecting. Watching is a flood of sensation. Collecting is a ledger. I left the recorder under the napkin when they leaned to talk. The little red light blinked back at me like an accused accomplice. For an hour, I listened to my own breathing and the bar's low hum. I felt ridiculous and precise at once. Ridiculous for crawling into corners of my life I never wanted to visit. Precise because the recordings were small nails driven into a crumbling wall of excuses. When they finally stood, it was with the practiced ease of two people who had rehearsed exits. They didn't stumble. They didn't whisper hurried apologies. They walked as if the night was an envelope addressed only to them. I followed at a distance that felt like a respectful cruelty, first down the street where the neon hummed, and then into the private elevator tucked behind a potted fern. The corridor on the third floor smelled of detergent and old perfume. Suite numbers marched in a neat row, brass numbers catching the light. I watched the key card slide into the door, and then vanish behind it with sound like a small, private dismissal. I crouched by the stairwell where the carpeting muffled me and pressed the tiny camera into the crack beneath the door. It was a small, stubborn rectangle of glass. It would record the scene, and later, when the light of evidence burned through the fog of words, the camera would be the only honest witness. I watched through a phone screen in the palm of my hand. They moved like people who owned each other's rhythm, drinks downed, jackets carelessly tossed, a laugh that softened the room. At one point, he reached for her face, and she didn't pull away. Her eyes closed, and something private slid into place between them. The moment felt obscene, because it was a happiness that had been bartered in secret. My hand trembled. I thought of walking in, of smashing glass, of dragging truth into daylight like some justice I could brandish. But fury is a loud instrument that plays badly in public. I wanted a clean score. I wanted a record that would not be softened by tearful apologies or pleas of exhaustion. I wanted something that would hold its shape the way a photograph does, immaculate and impossible to argue with. So I watched and recorded. The camera filled its memory with minutes and minutes of tenderness misapplied. I saved them like a miser saves coins, quiet, secret, accumulating weight. Then, when they lay down on the bed, and the room folded over itself as if it were never meant to be seen, I walked away. On the stairwell, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my sister. "Are you okay?" I typed yes and deleted it. Lies were cheap when they were meant to protect someone else. I told myself that what I was doing was for clarity, not cruelty. I told myself that later, when I had to show them the footage, I would be ashamed only of the humiliation and not of the necessity. Leaving the hotel, the night wrapped around me like a coat I hadn't chosen. The city glittered. Couples clung to each other on the sidewalk. A street vendor folded the last of his wares. The world kept pretending nothing had happened. I had evidence, and the feeling of carrying it was strange, like holding a secret passport to a life that wasn't my own. The recording sat on my phone like an accusation waiting to be opened. I replayed them twice, 3 times. Her voice, lighter than it had been with me, told him something about, "We have to be careful," and then laughed. Careful. The irony would have been almost funny if the sound didn't make my mouth dry. There's a stage in these things where options proliferate. You can call, confront, rage, beg, forgive, or you can plan. Forgiveness without reckoning feels thin. Rage without control is a story people tell and then forget. I wanted permanence. I wanted to rearrange the facts so that the truth sat where it could burn cleanly through the excuses. That thought, cold and practical, settled like frost on my spine. I didn't expose them the way TV shows do, with dramatic entrances and a defense attorney's flourish. I was repeating the same decision over and over in my head: expose her privately to the person who'd been deceived, or expose her publicly to everyone who mattered. The ledger answer won by the narrow logic of pain. If everyone who loved her saw it, she would have to live with the reflection the rest of her life. She could not stitch together a new truth out of old lies if everyone knew the shape of them. That night, I rented a small room at a community hall, white walls, a projector, folding chairs I could set in a semicircle. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. I booked it under my name, paid with a card I expected she'd never see. I wrote no invitations. The list of people I would tell hovered in the margins of my notebook: parents, siblings, a few mutual friends. People whose view of her would press on the wound until it stopped bleeding in silence. For now, though, it was only me and the recordings and the cold in my chest. Evidence felt like a blunt instrument until it was placed in a frame. I needed a frame that collected the light and didn't let it scatter into rumor. There were nights I almost lost the script. Once in the hotel bar, I had nearly reached for the receptionist and demanded the man's name, demanded that he be held accountable. The taste of revenge felt sweet and immediate in my mouth. But accountability isn't about satisfying a first thirst. It's about a lasting structural truth. A name can be learned. A pattern is harder to erase. So I planned. Days blurred into a montage of logistics: which cables to buy, where to hide a backup drive, how many copies to make, who to call when the time came. I thought of lawyers I didn't want to hire. I thought of friends who would take sides. I scribbled notes that looked like the script for an action film written by a man who wanted less spectacle and more consequence. One evening, I replayed the footage and paused on a close-up of her face as she smiled like the world had just given her a private joke. I let the image rest on my screen and then opened a new document and began to type names, dates, locations, until the facts were anchored to words. Words that I could read aloud in a room where people would either cradle her or turn away. It was not a comfortable exercise. It felt like cataloging a crime scene without gloves. There's a peculiar cruelty to the city at night. It hides, and it reveals in the same breath. Under sodium lamps, and in shuttered cafe windows, the truth looked different. It seemed to me then that exposing it publicly would not just be punishment. It would be a way of aligning what was said with what was real. I rehearsed a speech in the empty corridor of my apartment building, voice muffled by the stairwell that had once carried laughter. I practiced saying I have evidence until the words tasted normal. When I finally left the hotel for the last time that week, I did so with an odd lightness. The weight of ignorance had been replaced by the weight of proof, and the latter is at least directional. I could aim it. I could channel it. For the first time in months, I slept a little, because planning is a kind of sleep that steadies you. But sleep didn't make the next days gentle. I avoided her on the street for as long as I could, small civilities that were bloodless and therefore easier to weather. In public, we became practiced performers of a couple who had simply drifted. At home, I arranged my life like a man building a room in which evidence could be displayed soberly, without gloating. There was one night, 2 days before I planned to act, when I considered destroying the footage. I imagined waking up and putting the phone down and pretending I had never peeked, that I could will the world back to how it had been. I thought of calling her and weeping and asking for the small, utopian miracle of honest conversation. The fantasy was quick and clean, and then I remembered the nights she had not been at the table, the small text messages, and the empty bed. I couldn't unsee the way she had folded her needs around someone else. I couldn't undo the ledger. So I kept the footage and organized it. I burned 2 copies to drives and hid one in a bank safe deposit box and another in my sister's closet under a stack of holiday sweaters. I printed a thumbnail montage and slid it inside an envelope with dates and location headers. I wanted the truth to be mobile, portable, undeniable. The hotel footage had done something else too. It made me see myself as someone who could act with deliberation. The furious things that had roared inside me began to calibrate. I was not a man who wanted spectacle. I was someone who wanted closure. I was someone who, painfully, understood that people are rarely made whole by private apologies. Sometimes the public shape of truth is the only path back to private honesty. I booked the small community hall for a Thursday night and sent out careful messages. No accusations, no spoilers, just a simple please come by, there's something we should all talk about. Most people replied with concern, a few with curiosity. A handful said they'd be out of town. That was life. People show up or they don't. Some take your hand and others walk off the stage. On the night before, I walked past the hotel and paused under the same canopy. The neon blinked, indifferent. I felt no triumph. I felt something colder, an acceptance that the thing I was about to do would change more than my marriage. It would change my map of the future. I thought of the children we might not have, the Sunday mornings that would be hollow, the holidays that would be blunt instruments instead of glue. That collection of losses sat heavy, a price. And still I did not regret the plan. Because truth, once unearthed, tends to free the person holding the shovel as much as the earth it appends. I wanted to breathe without suspicion as the base note of my life. I wanted to be able to look at a woman and not catalog her movements like evidence. The camera feed on my phone was a quiet ledger of moments that no amount of conversation could fully erase. I had what I needed. The hotel had given me reality in a small rectangular memory. That night I went home, placed the drives in places where they would not be found by accident, and lay awake rehearsing how to say the simple, clean sentences that would make everything visible. When morning came, the city looked the same, traders in suits, kids with backpacks, the same mail carrier on her route. The ordinary persisted like an insult and a mercy. I drank my coffee and readied myself. The decision had been made. The frame was set. The truth would be shown, and I would stand beside it and say, plainly, what it had always been, a betrayal worth naming. Outside, the hotel continued its business, indifferent and perfect in its anonymity. Inside me, something else had been put in motion. The camera had seen. The city had hidden. Soon, both the hiding and the showing would meet in a room where people had to choose what to believe. The dining room was alive with the usual pre-dinner chatter, silverware clinking against plates, the sound of chairs scraping as relatives settled in. My parents sat at one end of the long oak table, her parents at the other, the weight of tradition pressing down on both sides like invisible bookends. Candles flickered against the wine glasses, painting everyone in a glow that felt too warm for what I was about to do. She sat across from me, her face radiant with the same smile that had once been mine alone. She chatted with my sister about vacations, asked my mother about the garden, and laughed at some half-hearted joke from my brother-in-law. If anyone had walked in at that moment, they'd have thought we were the perfect couple, hosting the perfect dinner. But my pocket buzzed with the weight of the truth, the drive resting like a stone against my thigh. I waited until the main course had been served, until everyone was relaxed and the hum of conversation was steady. My palms were slick, but my voice came out steadier than I'd expected. "There's something I need to share," I said, raising my glass slightly as if it were a toast. The room quieted. Forks stilled. Faces turned toward me, curiosity knitting their brows. My wife froze, her smile faltering. "Honey, maybe this isn't—" "No," I interrupted, my tone firmer now. "It has to be now." I set the glass down, pulled the small drive from my pocket, and walked to the head of the table where the projector was waiting. I'd borrowed it from work, claiming I needed it for a presentation. Now it sat like an executioner's blade, humming faintly as it powered on. "Please," I said, motioning toward the screen. "Watch." The first video flickered to life, grainy footage from the hotel bar. The room went utterly silent. Her face appeared, smiling at him in a way that stripped the air from my lungs. Then his hand, sliding across her back. The laughter, the intimacy. Gasps broke the silence. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. Her father leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the screen. My sister whispered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer. My wife shot up from her chair. "Turn it off! This is insane, you're—" "Sit down," I said, my voice cutting sharper than I'd ever heard it before. She froze. The authority in my tone wasn't something she could bend or manipulate. Slowly, she sank back into her seat, trembling. The next clip rolled. The hotel suite. Their bodies close, too close. Her laugh, her whispers about being careful. The evidence that left no room for denial. When the screen finally went black, the silence was suffocating. All eyes turned to her. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, her hands shaking against her lap. I can't explain," she stammered, but the words fell flat, lifeless against the undeniable. Her mother's voice cracked first. "How could you?" My father's eyes burned into me, then softened. "Son," he said, but no words followed. He didn't need to say them. I looked directly at her, the woman I'd once thought I'd spend my life with. "You lied to me. You lied to all of us. And now they know." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but no one moved to comfort her. The table that had once been a symbol of family was now an audience of judges, their verdict already written in the silence that followed. I gathered the drive and turned off the projector. "Dinner's over," I said simply. One by one, people stood. Chairs scraped back. My family avoided her eyes as they left. Her parents muttered something about shame, about betrayal, before following suit. Within minutes, the room was empty except for the two of us. She looked at me with eyes that pleaded for forgiveness, but I felt nothing. Not anger. Not even relief. Just a hollow clarity. "This," I said, gesturing to the dark screen, "is who you chose to be. And I choose not to be with you." I left her sitting there, alone at the table, her tears falling onto the untouched dessert plates. The house that had once echoed with laughter now rang with silence, but for the first time in months, It felt like honesty.